Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Rowan Deer. Rowan, welcome.
Hi, Sam. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for making time for us. You're the author of a wonderful new book, came out, I believe, in 2020. It's Radical Animism, Reading for the End of the World, out with Bloomsbury. And it's such a delightful text. So as soon as I was reading it, I was just like, oh, I gotta have you on here and talk to you about this. And of course, it's a podcast about religion and ecology, but we really try to think of environmental humanities broadly, and the stuff you're doing with environmental humanities, eco-criticism. I was just like, this is some of the most exciting things for me. So I was really happy to bring you on and chat with you. Before we get into the book, I wonder if you could say something a little bit more of by way of autobiographical reflections, because I'm always really curious what leads people into this kind of work, caring about the environment, but also doing that kind of work from a literary perspective or a philosophical perspective. Because a lot of times when people think of environmental work, they just want to do direct action, activism, maybe policy, and they don't necessarily think of it in terms of literature or philosophical work. So how did that kind of intersection come about for you?
Um, so the environmental interest has been really long running, like since I was a child. I don't know where it came from, and it's a bit of an odd characteristic actually, because my family are not that. um, so they're not the kind of family that like took me out hiking. We weren't always in nature, like literally none of that. I was a very like indoors booky child. There's the literary aspect for you. um but but yeah, for some reason I had from this very young age this kind of strong environmental consciousness, which is perhaps uh, well described by, I remember I was probably about 7 or 8, and my aunt was explaining to me the political parties in England. So the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Green Party. And she kind of explained their different policies to me, in 8-year-old language, and then asked me who I would vote for. And I said the Green Party. And she told me that no one votes for the Green Party because that's a wasted vote. Um, so I honestly can't explain really where that impulse came from, but it was obviously there from a very young age. Um, and as to combining it with literature, so yeah, as I said, I was very bookish. I always loved reading. It was I also kind of I grew up without any other children around me, so reading was kind of my main activity. Um, and yeah, kind of went on to study it at university, did my bachelor's and master's, started a PhD in literature, and I guess kind of from my master's, it started to have more of an environmental focus, and then and then with the PhD, it started off as like more like my idea was to have like a literary study of 4 modernist authors with this kind of environmental aspect. And then I went a bit insane, as lots of people do when they're trying to do a PhD, and I tried to leave. I like intermitted for a year, and was really sort of questioning whether I even wanted to do it. But I did eventually come back, and kind of the essential factor for me there was like, okay, this needs to be like fully about the environment, otherwise I just don't care enough. I can't see the point in it. So yeah, for me it was just yeah, it was a way to kind of, even though I had this like long-standing love of literature, it like wasn't enough to keep me engaged. Like I felt like I needed it to somehow speak more to the crises that we're facing as a species. So yeah, that's how I got there.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's very, very kind of similar trajectory for me, at least in terms of thinking that, doing, any kind of academic work without addressing ecological emergency feels so useless, or like, I don't know, like playing the fiddle while Rome burns, or I don't know, whistling in the dark. I'm not sure what it is, but it feels. And sometimes reading environmental work, that it just is just talking about it as if it's like, oh, there's a problem, we're working on it, don't worry. Like, it's actually extremely serious. How are people not just freaking out about this, or at least addressing the severity of the emergency?
Yeah.
um, so, that's a kind of bigger topic that I want to see if you can share some of your experience about, which is just the kind of abject failures of academia to really rise to the moment. And of course, other institutions are having their problems too. But so I wonder if you could say a little about that, and feel free to be as jaded as you want to be, because these are real failings, and I think holding these
Yeah.
institutions accountable is important.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I should say I'm not working in academia anymore. And yeah, although kind of that environmental focus gave me enough of a point to get the PhD done, in the years after the PhD, as I was pursuing postdoctoral research, this kind of niggling unease that I had about academia as an institution in general, but also how it relates to environmental issues. So, the fact that, okay, you can write the most strident academic article, proposing the solution to all of our environmental problems, and it's read by who exactly? Like five other researchers, maybe your professor. Like,
Right.
it's not exact. It doesn't feel very impactful, especially in the humanities. I mean, maybe if you're working in a subject where you're actually kind of impacting policy and stuff, then it's a different story. But yeah, it kind of, for me, it just felt like what I was doing was like still so far removed from the rest of the world, and the things that I cared about. Um, and I I don't want to be completely jaded. Like, it's not that I think that these academic departments shouldn't exist anymore, and I think there is, of course, still value in careful thinking and just learning to read well, like learning to be a sensitive, responsive reader, because that is a skill that, okay, you put to work when you're writing an academic essay, but it also makes you a different kind of person in the world, right? But yeah, for me, it felt, well, for that reason and for other more practical reasons, I kind of felt like I needed to try and do something else.
And so, what are you up to these days?
So for the past year, I've been working at a cultural institution in Berlin. It's called Haus der Kulturen der Welt. It means the House of World Cultures. And they have this project called Anthropocene Curriculum. And so I basically am writing and editing for the website of that project, and also doing other things, actually. Like, I've done a couple of podcasts for them. I'm currently working on a video script. But basically it means that I've been kind of really engaging with the actual geological science of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene Working Group, who have been tasked with kind of looking for stratigraphic evidence of the geological Anthropocene at 12 sites all over the world, they have been collaborating with Haus der Kulturen der Welt since 2013, so for 10 years now. And it's at the house that they present a lot of their research, and there's a lot of like collaborative events where you'll have scientists and artists and humanists kind of talking to each other. So as cultural institutions go, it is quite a academic one, but it obviously also has this public facing aspect. So for me, it felt like a really good stepping stone to kind of use my knowledge and my thinking about the Anthropocene and environmental issues, but to be able to start writing for a public audience.
That's great. That's exciting work. I always like seeing those kind of events where there's people from just all different sectors and disciplines kind of learn to collaborate and share their perspectives with one another. and public facing work, especially. I mean, that's one of the things I'm always, trying to get into a little more, at least with the work, with the Forum on Religion Ecology. We have this podcast and a few things. So it's a little bit more public facing than just journal articles and the normal academic conferences and that kind of stuff. So I
Hmm.
like that a lot. And, the Anthropocene figures really prominently in the book. So I want to talk a little bit more about radical animism. You kind of had me with the title. Even that alone, I was like, oh, reading after the end of the world. I always like any afters because there's a little ambiguity. Sometimes when you're after something, you're seeking it in a way, right? You're going toward it, but obviously it also means being subsequent to it.
Hmm.
So, thinking really of those limits, but also even radical. To cover the book, get a sense that radical isn't just politically radical. There's roots,
Hmm.
and so I wonder if you could just say a little bit like what's radical animism. Animism is kind of a loaded word, I think, in some contexts, and might ruffle some feathers. And so, but you clarify it in a really interesting way.
Um, Thank you. So, animism, just kind of to give a basic definition so that anyone listening is kind of on the same page. The word animism comes from a Victorian anthropologist called E.B. Tylor, who used it to describe the belief systems of so called primitive peoples who saw that there was life or agency in non-human, non-living things. So this notion of kind of spirit in rocks and rivers and things like that. And this was obviously a kind of pejorative term. He was ascribing kind of theistic religions as being somehow higher and more evolved than these animistic religions. Um, but my notion of a radical animism is, as you say, so the word radical comes from the Latin radix, meaning root. So it's the notion that there is an animism at root in human culture, psychology, language, that it affects everything that we think and do. It also kind of has a particular significance in light of climate change, where, of course, the planet seems to have its own agency and is kind of demanding that we respond to it. And it's a little bit like, I guess, the Bruno Latour, "We have never been modern," is kind of the notion. Well, we've never not been animists. We might
Mhm.
have thought that we were not animists for a while, but actually it's really kind of central to being alive, to being conscious. So that's kind of I try to argue that it's just everywhere, but I guess the kind of key places that you find it in the book is in language. So the notion that language has a life of its own, that language is animistic, that it kind of not only kind of shapes what we think and say and what we can think and say, but that also when we read a text, that the language kind of gets up to things on its own. It kind of makes connections that the author perhaps intended, perhaps didn't intend. The language kind of does that on its own. And then also within the unconscious mind. So, we have this kind of, and this kind of fits in again with this like modern delusion, but we all sort of walk around as if we are the agents of a rational will. But actually, as psychoanalysis and modern psychology and neuroscience show us, the unconscious mind is kind of making decisions that we're not even aware of, or before we're even aware of them. So there's this kind of gap between the conscious I that we think we are and these other forces, these unconscious forces that are driving and shaping our actions. Um, yeah, and so I guess for me, it's about you can't suppress these effects, but it's about kind of becoming aware of them and recognizing them and thinking, okay, what does that mean if I'm not really in control? If we as a species are not really in control, how might that change how we act and interact with the world around us?
Right. Yeah. That's such a big lesson to learn. Like, oh, okay, turns out I'm not really in control here at all. And I really thought I was. Not at all. And even things, I mean, you think, well, at least my own language, I must be in control of that. These are the words I'm speaking. I'm like, no, sorry. You're not, you can't quite nail these things down. And I guess this is one of the things that's been so contested about even the term Anthropocene, is it's giving so much agency to the human and to the human kind of in general. We're like, well, it's not necessarily like us in charge here, and I think that's kind of, you know, so you have other things, you know, Donna Haraway's Thulu scene and, you know, things like that. People drawing attention to Gaia, and it's like, yeah, it's not really us. And to the extent that it's not us alone. It's us, you know, immersed in this, you know, bigger world. So I know, you know, you read the very idea of the Anthropocene in relationship to Kafka.
Mm.
So I wonder if you could say something about that. I think that's a really interesting connection, a great way to kind of flesh out what the challenge of the Anthropocene is all about.
Yeah, so in the kind of introductory chapter of the book, I read Kafka's Metamorphosis, which might also be translated as the transformation. It's Verwandlung in German. So I kind of use this image where he wakes up one morning and finds that he's become a monstrous vermin, right? That kind of might be a parable or a fable for our situation where we have just kind of begun to wake up to the fact that we have kind of become the monstrous vermin of the world. Like we were just going about our lives, we were, you know, doing our work, living, making what we thought was progress in industry and technology, and actually all these kind of insidious accumulative effects have changed that situation so much that whereas we may have once thought, okay, we are the most advanced species on the planet, you know, look how well we're doing, but actually we kind of wake up and it's like, oh, we are undermining the very conditions upon which we rely to live. So yeah, and then there's just loads in that story about, you know, the kind of the way that his family treat him, and so this kind of relations between humans and non-humans that are also quite interesting for thinking about the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And in general, it's just, you know, one of the great things about using literature to think through these things is just it's so much rich imagery and metaphor, and so it helps you see so many more aspects to what's going on. I think sometimes if you think of the Anthropocene just in terms of geology, we're missing that sense, that horrifying sense of waking up and being like, "Uh-oh, this
Mm-hmm.
is not going well." So the kind of affective dimension to all this comes out really well.
Yeah,
Um,
and that kind of that reading that I give of Kafka, or that kind of, I don't know, suggested itself to me, is like another example of this animism. So like, you know, when I was at doing my bachelor's, like that story was taught as like a parable about disability, or like, you know, these kind of all these different things that metaphor was for. And it's kind of, it's not that Kafka was writing a parable about climate change, it's that the context that we're in also works to change the text, or the text transforms itself in relation to the context, and that's kind of part of the magic of language and literature that I try to attend to.
I think that's so important. I think there's still a pretty big tendency where people want to think of a text in terms of like the author's intentions. And
Mm.
like, oh, well, what were they thinking? What were they meaning? Like, well, it really overflows that so much. And so to kind of look at a text like it has its own agency and changes with times and contexts and things. I think that's so important. Just, you know, and I know there's plenty of authors who've drawn attention to that, but I feel like there's still this tendency for people to be like, the real meaning of the text is whatever Kafka meant when he was writing it. Like, no, I don't know if he would have thought that either necessarily. Um,
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, yeah, I think for me as well, like reading needs to have this kind of radical openness. So even though I can say, okay, you know, I'm giving this reading of Kafka that that links it to climate change and the environment, like I'm absolutely not saying that that is now the meaning of the text or that is the definitive reading. It's about this kind of, yeah, complete openness to the text as this thing that is like endlessly rich and productive, and yeah, can respond to context just as much as you respond to it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, although it sounds better when you go, this is the definitive reading of Kafka. That's no, I don't know if it's possible to have a definitive reading once and for all. So yeah, I don't know, just like the way that you engage all the texts in the book for that reason, just like you can see them kind of shape shifting with the context and how like, well, the Anthropocene is making really all of the history of literature and of science, philosophy. It's really changing all of it. Everything looks so different. Kind of that, we've never not been animists. All of a sudden you realize, oh, right, the texts themselves are animated. Everything has this kind of
Mm-hmm.
agency. Once you decenter the human a little bit, everything shows up in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, it's kind of an overarching theme for the whole book, is this idea that Freud had, right? That there's these three blows against human narcissism that have happened, and Copernicus saying that turns out we're not the center of the world, and then you have Darwin saying, by the way, we're not that different than animals. In fact, we are animals. We're related to animals. And then Freud gives himself credit for dealing the third blow, right, and saying that our rational minds are really just the tip of an iceberg, and we're mostly all these drives and instincts and things, and we're not in charge. So there's this really profound decentering of the human subject and human agency, and you read those three blows alongside some literary figures, right? And so it's what Copernicus gets read alongside Virginia Woolf, and Darwin gets read alongside Lewis Carroll, and some other folks, Helen Macdonald, Nicholas Royal. And then you read Freud with Shakespeare and Clarice Lispector. So I don't know, I think those are really interesting juxtapositions. One of the things that excites me the most about work in environmental humanities or eco-criticism is when you just see people juxtaposing things that you wouldn't necessarily see in any other context. The idea of like Darwin with Lewis Carroll, like who would have thought of that? So I don't know. I'm curious how those juxtapositions came to you in the first place, and then kind of what you do with them.
Hmm. Um, how did they come to me in the first place? It was
It's worst question, right? It's always like asking like a comedian, how do you come up with your jokes? They're like, I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah, but I wish I had something profound to say, but I feel like it was much more chancy than that. It was me wanting to write about things that I enjoy, and kind of, you know, finding the connections there. So yeah, Wolf goes alongside Copernicus. So obviously, yeah, as you said, that's kind of learning that we're not the center of a physical, but also a conceptual universe. And then I read two Woolf novels, To the Lighthouse and The Waves, which kind of also really have this decentering aspect. Although they are books about human characters, there are in both texts these passages that are completely absent of humans, right? So in The Waves, there's these interspersed bits of description about the waves on the shore, and into The Lighthouse, there's this whole middle section called Time Passes that's just about an empty house. So kind of on the like broader narrative structural level, you have this kind of attention to or decentering, attention to the non-human or decentering of the human. But I think that it also happens on a much more micro scale. So kind of at the level of language and rhythm, Woolf is super attentive to what I call the animism of rhythm. So the way that kind of when you're writing, there's certain words that sound better in a certain order. So, kind of the actual materiality of the letters and the words themselves start to dictate how they are arranged on the page, which then, of course, changes exactly what you're writing. Um, and then Darwin and Carroll. I think the Carroll thing, I was just like rereading Alice in Wonderland for fun, and I'd shortly turned vegan. So I turned vegan kind of a little bit into my PhD, because like as I was reading more about climate change and stuff, I was like, I mean, I'd already previously been vegetarian, but I was like, I can't be involved in this dairy industry business anymore. Not that I was involved in that sounds wrong. You know what I mean? I can't
Yeah.
be contributing to
Right.
industrial dairy farming. Anyway, and then um, I was reading Alice in Wonderland, and I was like, this is like a vegan book. Like it's
Hmm.
so there's all these like encounters where she's, you know, kind of talking to these different animals, and when she's kind of she'll be like talking to an animal, and then she'll like says, oh, like I've seen them before at din, like cutting herself off before saying dinner. And it's like she's having all these little micro realizations that these people, animals that she's talking to, she had previously only known in the context of of the dining table. And yeah, the moment at the end when you know, the Red Queen introduces her to the joint, and then Alice offers to carve her a slice, and the Red Queen says it's not polite to carve someone who you've been introduced to. And it's like, well, no, it's not. That would be really, really rude. But, you know, obviously, kind of within the structure of a meat eating society, it's kind of made to seem okay. And so for me, suddenly there were all these moments in Alice that were kind of bringing up this awareness of how we are related to other beings, and how they're not just objects. And then yeah, I guess just to finish off the little three there. So the last one is Freud and Shakespeare. For that, so for this blow, just as a reminder, it's obviously about the unconscious mind. And so for that one, it's where I noticed when I was reading Beyond the Pleasure Principle that there's these like 4 O's that his little grandson is kind of saying, because he can't say fought or gone. And it just, I think maybe I had been reading Hamlet at the same time, but it just like reminded me of Hamlet's dying breath that is in some editions of Hamlet. And obviously Freud is very famously into Shakespeare, but when I started looking into it, the more parallels that I could kind of see between Freud's text and Shakespeare's text. And then it was kind of about me thinking, well, did Freud consciously have Hamlet in mind when he was writing Beyond the Pleasure Principle, or was it just there in his unconscious?
Right.
And we'll never know. And you know, but in the end, it doesn't really matter, because there's a level at which these kind of relations work beyond authorial intention, as we've already said. Yeah, and I guess kind of with all of this stuff that I've just said, and with all of the readings that I give in the book, it's kind of then all brought back to the notion of, okay, what does this decentering, this relationality, this awareness of the unconscious mind, like what does that mean in the context of the climate crisis and the Anthropocene? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's very good overview of really a lot of complex material for the book. I appreciate how you're able to put that in such a succinct way. Because even sometimes after I write something and somebody's like, "What did you write?" I'm like, "I don't know." It's in
I
there.
had to look at the introduction again today, because you invited me to this, and like you're like, oh, this new book, it doesn't feel like a new book to me. It feels like ancient history. And I was like, oh my God, what did I write? So I like re-looked at the introduction to remind myself of that. But I'm glad that it yeah, came across clear.
Yeah, that's funny. Speaking of how a text exceeds authorial intention, you're like, oh, I don't know what's in there. I'll have to look again at the text.
Yeah,
And you're
exactly,
like, oh, who wrote
exactly.
this? Oh, this is pretty good. I think I like this author. Uh, and and geez, Freud's talking about these blows to human narcissism, a little while ago, and I feel like I'm not sure if people have really digested that. I mean, I think also of like the field of environmental ethics for like 50 years has been going on and on about how we're too anthropocentric and we need to wake up to a larger center, whether it's biocentrism, ecocentrism, whatever. And meanwhile, it seems like a lot of people are just doubling down on being anthropocentric, like they're not listening to this. And even though, you ask somebody, well, do you think Copernicus was right? And they're like, sure, sure. Yeah, we revolve around the sun. I get it. They're like,
Hmm.
but do you? Like, have
Hmm.
we really digested this? Or that we're, as humans, we're descended from a line of apes. And so it's like, oh, sure, yeah, I know, yeah, evolution's real, Darwin, sure. Like, I'm not. Are people really digesting this? And so, I wonder, how that figures into this, because clearly things like the climate crisis and the Anthropocene in general are really driven by some of these attitudes of human narcissism. And so, why aren't we listening, or what's going on with that? How is that affecting us?
Um, yeah, so I mean, the other move that the book makes, somewhat predictably perhaps, is to talk about the climate crisis as a fourth blow to human narcissism that kind of comes as a direct result of what you've just been saying. So precisely because we know these things but don't really act in a way that is according to that knowledge. So, we know we're not the center of the universe. We know that we're related to other animals. We know in some sense that we have an unconscious mind, but we don't act as if that is the case. We go on kind of acting as if we're separate from the environment around us, and that we're rational beings who can vote and make decisions based on this kind of unshakable rationality. That kind of, yeah, the build up of this delusion can trace its way directly to the what has caused all the environmental crises that we're dealing with today. And so, and kind of to relate this all back to animism, um, those kind of those first three blows are suppressible, are deniable. But then this one, because it issues from the planet itself rather than from a human discovery, so Copernicus, Darwin, Freud, this is now the planet issuing the fourth blow. And so we don't have the choice now to say, okay, we know that, but we'll not do anything. I mean, that is actually exactly what's happening. We know it and we're not doing anything. But as we're seeing more and more, with droughts, with wildfires, with glaciers melting, it's just the beginning of something that could potentially cause unimaginable suffering for so many humans and other species of life, that can, is already wiping out so many unique, irreplaceable species. And in the end will very much undermine the conditions on which we depend to live. So yeah, it's kind of the notion that, yeah, this fourth blow forces us to act in some way. Whether we do act in time is another question. But
Right. Yeah, and in some sense, I mean, when you think of some of the species we've already lost, we're already too late. And so, yeah, the idea of, well, do we have time? We have time for some things, but we're definitely too late for others. And I guess this, brings us to, your subtitle that we're reading after the end of the world. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the end of the world. I mean, that's a cheery topic to get into, but what does it mean to be reading after the end of the world?
Um, so sorry, I'm going to have to correct you. It's reading for the end of
For
the
the, oh
world,
geez, thank you.
not after.
That's, well,
Um,
that's even heavier in a lot of ways.
um, yes and no. So the it's supposed to have a kind of double meaning. So the word world, and as anyone who reads the book will discover, I'm very interested in etymology, and the kind of animistic things that go on within words. The word world comes from the Old Danish wereld, meaning the age of man. So just like werewolf is man wolf, this wereld is man age. And so when I'm saying reading for the end of the world, in one sense, it's okay, a reading that is appropriate for this apocalyptic time that we're living through. In another sense, it's for, in the sense of supporting the end of the age of man, not looking for the extinction of the human, I hope, but the end of the age of man with a capital M, this conception of human beings as this rational, separable agent that can kind of just, you know, plunder other cultures and environmental resources in the name of progress with a capital P. And yeah, and kind of, so reading for the end of the world would be, can we be open to a new way of being in which we respect not only the kind of the animism of other creatures, non-living entities, but the kind of the animism that shifts in the grounds of ourself, and kind of have a much more, therefore, humble way of being and relating in the world.
Right, right. Humility. Yeah, such a simple lesson in a way, and yet so much to digest. I mean, especially when you think, for instance, that that would mean we might want to change our diets once you know, really realize who we are, what's going on. That's, you know, that's, there's a lot packed into that. And and one of the things I also appreciate in the book is that you're thinking with Jacques Derrida quite a bit. And I don't know, I think it's been in recent years, there's started to be a movement toward a kind of ecological deconstruction, and people have started to see the relevance of that. Otherwise, I don't know, people, when he's, oh, there's nothing outside the text, he's just talking about books all the time, and it's just stuck in language. It's obviously so much more complicated than that. And so it's just, you know, a breath of fresh air to see you engaging his thought in such a creative way, in a way that's so relevant to our time, to the Anthropocene. And so I'm just kind of a cheerleader for Derrida in some respects. So I
Mm,
was just really happy to see that. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about Derrida. I know, you know, from a literary background, I think people take him pretty seriously, and
mm,
but not necessarily in an ecological way. And so I wonder how
yeah,
he's come into your thinking and how he came into this book. And
sure. So first, I would like to debunk the misreading of "there is nothing outside the text," which, you know, most quoted and most misunderstood line in his work, right? Um, So he's not saying there is nothing outside the text on the page and that, you know, all we think about is language. He's saying that everything is textual and that human language and writing, so writing, speech, is just one species of a whole ecosystem of marks and traces. Um, so rather than elevating human language, he's actually kind of, you know, bringing it into level with this whole other world of traces that includes, you know, the unconscious mind, but also non-human traces. So yeah, for me, he's a profoundly environmental thinker, even when he's not thinking about the environment, just because of the way that he's so perceptive about reality. Um, as for kind of how I came to him, I mean, it's very kind of practical thing as well. My PhD supervisor is a quite well-known Derrida scholar, so kind of, you know, growing up intellectually with him just meant that I was exposed to a lot of his work, and then found it very compelling. I will caveat it with that, with the fact that I do see and recognize that like a lot of Derrida is like unnecessarily hard to read. And like I just want to say to like anyone listening, if you are struggling reading Derrida, like it's not your fault. Um, like because it's something that I really try to do with my work is like be generous to the reader, and like,
Yeah.
I really think that there should always be a way that you can express yourself in a very clear way. And I'm obviously not as great a thinker as Derrida, so maybe I just don't understand his more difficult stuff well, and that's fine with me actually. But yeah, I guess I'm a little bit ambivalent. Like I so love so many of his ideas, but it takes so much effort to like get your head around them that it's kind of it's a little bit like that thing that makes me uneasy about academia in general, that is there's this kind of like exclusive inward facing club. So yeah, I kind of I wish for more clarity and generosity in writing. But that said, as he kind of relates to the book a little bit more, so I mean, aside from the stuff about language and text, he has this kind of real sustained deconstruction of anthropocentrism and thinking of animals and animality. So in books like The Animal That Therefore I Am and The Beast and the Sovereign, there's a short interview that he gives called Eating Well, where he kind of talks about the way that meat eating is kind of inscribed into our culture. And actually, when you said earlier putting Darwin and Carroll together, like who would have thought of that? In The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida actually says, like, I would have liked to inscribe this whole talk through a reading of Lewis Carroll. And then he says, maybe I did without your knowing it, which is just a quite nice, funny moment. So yeah, maybe that was also kind of affected my bringing him in there. And then also he thinks very deeply about like ethics and responsibility, which is of course really important for thinking about environmental questions. He has this line from a Jewish poet, Paul Celan, that he often returns to, which translated into English is, "The world is gone, I must carry you." And again, kind of, obviously with these ideas that I'm having about thinking about the end of the world, but that there is then kind of, with the fact of the end of the world, whether that's the apocalyptic end of the world or the end of the age of man, there comes this responsibility, I must carry you. There's like an injunction to then do something for the other.
Yeah, very well said. I really love that line from Salon. Such a beautiful line, and the way Derrida works with it, and I really appreciate you also mentioning that Derrida seems unnecessarily difficult, and yeah, because I find that even with people who really adore Derrida's thinking, they're still like, he could have probably said that in a clearer way, and it's one of those things. There's just so many kind of hoops to go through, or there's just a lot of work to get into something, and then there's some core insight that's just so amazing. Where like
Yeah.
he maybe didn't need all the rhetorical distantiations to get there, but I like where you
Yeah.
got, but wow, that was quite a ride to get there.
Yeah, and it makes all the kind of pushback against him quite understandable, right?
Yeah,
Because there are a lot of people who really hate him,
yeah,
and I think that is at least in part the reason. Maybe a little bit of further shameless self-promotion. I also wrote a introduction to deconstruction for the Oxford Oxford Encyclopedia of Literary Theory,
Hmm.
which is basically just like a chapter-length introduction to Derrida and deconstruction and the different aspects of his work, not necessarily related to the environment, but in general. And I'm quite proud of the way that I managed to kind of distill and make it a little bit more accessible for, you know, learners or someone who's coming to his work for the first time. So if anyone is interested and wants to have a look at that, do so. And if you can't get hold of it, get in touch with me.
Oh, nice. Yeah, thanks. I'll definitely be checking that out. Because even though I like Derrida's work a lot, I'm still at a point where like, wait, what exactly are some of these ideas? So yeah, clear secondary sources are just such a gift and so important. And I think it's getting better with time. We're gradually figuring out what this guy was saying. It'll probably still take a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but on that note, I'm curious, what other projects you have in the mix these days? Are you working on any new books or articles, any other kind of writing, or what do you see kind of on the horizon?
So I just had an article published actually in Ecozone, um, which is on mycorrhizal metaphors.
Hmm.
Um, and it's kind of thinking about language as fungal, um, and yeah, and sort of through a reading of Elizabeth Jane Burnet's memoir, The Grassling. And yeah, kind of thinking about language as fungal in terms of, I guess, in this unconscious way where there's this like kind of, you know, underground mycelium that is completely out of our sight. And then like the words are kind of like mushrooms that like pop up in different places, but there's all these like underground connections that we're not necessarily aware of. I actually wrote that in like 2020, but as academic publishing sometimes goes, it took a while for it to come out, but that came out this month. Um, that was also kind of the basis for I was applying for another postdoc to kind of work on fungi and literature more deeply. I still haven't heard back from that, but at this point, I'm kind of like maybe I'm just gone from academia anyway. Um, so yeah, I'm writing a novel,
Hmm.
which is kind of also about the Anthropocene and human memory and the unconscious, and yeah, lots of the things that we've already talked about, but kind of in the frame of a fictional story.
Hmm.
So that feels really great. I mean, I love that kind of, well, I think the book Radical Animism is on the creative end of academic writing anyway, but like I love the agency of kind of really yeah, writing very freely. Yeah, and then I don't know, I'm in a little bit of a limbo state because my contract at my current job is about to finish, and
Hmm.
I don't really know what I'm gonna do next. Like maybe some freelance writing and editing for a while, but yeah, I'm in that. You know, I sort of left academia and thought, well, at least I won't be precariously employed anymore, but
Right.
I'm still precariously employed. Um,
That's true. That's a
we'll
problem
see.
bigger than academia,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that really, speaks to our moment in general, that the kind of liminality of, we're at this point where the old world kind of is crumbling and we don't know exactly what the future holds. And so this seems very appropriate to the conditions of the Anthropocene. Like, oh,
Mm.
I'm not sure exactly. We'll see. Our whole species is precariously employed right now.
Oh, yeah, I mean, just because it's in fashion, shall we say, doesn't make it feel any better.
That's true. It's no consolation.
No.
Maybe even kind of makes it worse. Like, if it was just me, that'd be one thing. Knowing it's this whole problem, it's kind of, yeah,
Mm.
it's a little twist of the knife there. Um, Well, geez, I wonder, well, one last thing I'm curious about is veganism, because
Hmm.
that's a big commitment, and even vegetarianism. And so for anybody who's kind of tuning in who maybe is a vegetarian who hasn't transitioned to veganism and is maybe thinking about it, or somebody who's just full on still eating meat and maybe not even thinking about, organic or anything, what's been that journey like for you?
Hmm.
It's a big question, and like, because some people I know, some people who are being raised vegetarian by their parents, so they grow up with that. It's just kind of normal to begin with.
Yeah.
So I wonder, when did you kind of make the leap into vegetarianism?
Um, I became vegetarian when I was 14 because I thought it was cool and I wanted to annoy my family.
That's good.
No, no, no great like moral high ground there, unfortunately. That kind of came later. I think I then like was vegetarian for a few years and sort of then later like became more aware of animal cruelty and environmental issues. Um yeah, and then as I said, kind of the veganism came once I started working on my PhD and became more aware of it.
Hmm.
Um, for me, it was never that hard, honestly. Um, so I don't know how much advice I can really give for people that are like really struggling. But I will say that after this long, I don't miss anything at all. The like alternatives now are like so much better than 10 years ago. So that makes it so much easier. But also, I guess, okay, the one like key bit of advice that I would give is like it doesn't need to be all or nothing. So I think people have this mentality of like, okay, if I can't be vegan all the time, then I may as well just eat meat at every meal. Like actually reducing is hugely impactful. So, you know, so like explore things that you like, try to just incorporate it like a bit more frequently and like don't beat yourself up if you slip up, like I think it's so much more to it than as with all the environmental actions with flying and car driving and stuff. There's so much more to it than the decision of like, okay, this is the best thing for the environment and this is the worst thing.
Yeah.
Like it's bound up in emotion and memory and family and culture. And so, I think that as with everything, like compassion has to be kind of key to how you go about it.
Nice. I like that a lot. Yeah, I think in general, the kind of purity ethics gets in the way of a lot of things. It's like, oh, it's all or nothing. Like, yeah, it's okay if you can just do every little bit helps. Doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I like, if somebody's looking for motivation, do it to make your parents mad. I like that a lot. Hey, I'm just trying to be
Yeah.
cool, make my
You
parents
don't you
mad.
don't have to dye your hair black at the same time and like wear black lipstick, but I just did that too for good measure.
Just for good measure. Oh, that's great. That's a good way in. Like, oh, it's not really about the environment.
It is
Just,
now. It is now. It just
yeah,
wasn't then. I was
that's
young.
the, yeah. I like just trying to be cool is like the gateway into eventually caring about the environment. I think that's great. Well, geez, that's perfect advice. Just be cool. You'll care about the environment in the long run. Hard to find a better note to end on. So, geez, Rowan, thanks so much for making time for us. I've really enjoyed this. One of the great things about this podcast is I just get to invite authors on that I really like their work and get to chat with them. So this was just a treat. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it as well.
Great, and thanks for our audience for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you later. And in the meantime, take care and be well.